So in this lesson, I'm going to go over pedigree trees. And a pedigree tree is basically a chart that shows the genetic history of a family, and it typically has multiple generations. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the different parts of a pedigree tree so you can see exactly how to interpret one. So here we have an example of a pedigree tree, and I'm going to walk you through everything. If you see a circle, it's representing a female. If you see a square, you have a male. Anytime you have a line connecting the two, that would represent a marriage. A marriage, or two that had a child together. If they are connected with a vertical line, then that's representing the offspring from those original two parents. So in the vertical line, it brings us down here, and we have a circle and a square. So these two individuals had one child here, and one child here. So they had two daughters and one son. So there are three children from those first parents. So we would say this is the first generation. This would now be our second generation. And then this bottom line is showing us all our third generation of offspring. So another piece here, so if we look at one of the children, so we have one of the sons, we have a horizontal line showing that these two were married or had children together, and therefore they had two children, so they had two circles here representing two females. This one was never married, did not have any children, so we don't see anything connected to it. And the same thing here, we have one female connected with a male. So these two were the parents of three children down here. Now, the other thing I haven't mentioned yet is why they are color coded. So on this particular pedigree, we have a shaded in color, this blue color, and this is representing that particular person or that particular individual has a trait, a specific trait. And it looks like this one is representing a forelock trait. So if you see in the picture that little piece of white or gray hair, that is a particular trait that you can inherit. So anyone in this pedigree chart that has a blue color or shaded in is going to have that trait. If it is white or not shaded in, that means that person does not have the trait. Now, typically, when we're looking at pedigree charts, we're going to look at dominant traits versus recessive traits. So all of those traits we've been talking about so far this year. And what we know when we look at something that's specifically a dominant pedigree chart is that since it's a dominant trait, anyone who is shaded in, they have at least one dominant allele. So they could be homozygous or they could be heterozygous. Either way, they have the dominant allele. Anyone who's not affected, so those ones that are not shaded in, those are telling us that since they don't have the dominant trait, therefore they must have the recessive alleles. So if we were looking at their genotype, they would have two recessive alleles. When you're trying to interpret a pedigree chart, there's first places to look, and that would be anyone that has a recessive trait. So if we have a recessive trait, we already know their genotype, and then we can kind of piece together to figure out the ones that have the dominant traits. So here, if we were trying to interpret what's going on, since it's a dominant pedigree, any of the dark colored shapes, those people would have the dominant trait. The ones that are not shaded in are automatically recessive. So if I were to give an allele to it, let's say capital A and lowercase a, any of the ones that are not shaded in would be lowercase a, lowercase a, lowercase a, lowercase a. And then we can piece together to figure out our dominant ones. Now, we also will look at a recessive pedigree. So if a particular trait is passed along with only a recessive allele, what we know in this case, again, is if we have a someone with the trait, that means they must have the recessive alleles. So in this case, since it is a recessive pedigree, the people that are affected or the ones that have the trait will be shaded dark. So we would know any of those particular individuals would have, again, let's go with lowercase a. Now, anyone that's not affected, so the ones that are not shaded, these would have at least one dominant allele. Just by looking at it, we can't always tell if it's a homozygous or a heterozygous, but we at least know that there was at least one dominant allele present. So again, when we're trying to interpret the genotypes or trying to interpret anything on these charts, if we have a recessive pedigree chart, again, we're going to start by looking at the ones that have the recessive trait. So any of the ones that have that dark shaded in shape. That's going to guarantee that we know our alleles. One thing I didn't mention, again, if we have multiple generations, sometimes they're labeled with Roman numerals. So you'll see generation 1, generation 2, and generation 3. So finally, I'm just going to walk you through one final example. So we have a sample recessive pedigree. So here, if it is shaded, then it means that this particular individual has the recessive trait. If it's not shaded, then it has at least one dominant allele. So we have our first generation, our second generation, our third generation, and a fourth generation. There are 4 total generations here. If we look at our initial parents, we can see how many children those initial parents had, and because they are connected vertically, and they would have 1, 2, and 3. Of those children, the square, both of the squares would be sons, and then we would have a female with the circle. All of the 3 children had their own offspring, and you can continue down with that pattern.